Okay, so let's unpack this. Today we are doing a deep dive into a leadership blueprint that, honestly, it challenges the very DNA of modern management. We're exploring Chris R. Villas's book, Lead with Purpose, guiding people and resources with purpose and accountability. And our mission isn't just to, summarize the ideas, it's to see if we can synthesize a practical, actionable blueprint that really shifts a leader's focus away from ownership and extraction to accountability, ethical care, and multiplication. It's being pitched as this complete roadmap, and we need to figure out how it works.
And that shift in focus you mentioned, that's the absolute core of this deep dive. Right out of the gate, the source material just reframes leadership identity. And while the book is, well, it's philosophically grounded in some deep spiritual principles, it draws heavily from the parable of the talents. The author's intention seems very clear. These ideas are meant for everyone. Whether you're an executive in a Fortune 500 company, an entrepreneur launching a startup, anyone managing significant responsibilities.
So we're not just looking at a set of leadership tactics here. This is more like a foundational ethical overhaul, applying ancient wisdom to, the modern corner office.
Exactly. The source argues that most leadership failures, especially the ones involving, say, ethical collapse or just burnout, they trace back to a faulty identity. The belief that you own the resources or the people you manage. By using the parable of the talents as the philosophical basis, the framework immediately establishes this moral obligation. Your job isn't just to maintain what you've got, it's to demonstrate responsibility, growth, and faithful multiplication of that trust.
Okay, let's really nail down that central idea because this is the biggest mindset shift the source offers. You move from being an owner to being a steward, which means you are redefined not as the possessor of people or resources, but as a caretaker, someone entrusted to develop, protect, and multiply everything under your management.
That's the entire pivot. It's really an exercise in fiduciary responsibility. You're managing on behalf of some ultimate stakeholder, and your authority has to be balanced with humility, your influence with radical responsibility.
But why is that philosophical pivot so powerful in a practical, even a secular context? The source calls this the moral architecture. What competitive advantage does operating from this position of, well, non-ownership actually offer a modern company?
What's fascinating here is that the moral architecture isn't just moral, it's also just excellent governance. The foundation is rooted in this ancient wisdom that ultimate ownership resides somewhere else, which for a secular leader really just means operating under the assumption that you are transient, that your tenure is temporary. It cites the idea that humanity's original charge in the Garden of Eden was to work it and keep it, to protect and cultivate, and that framework forces long-term planning.
Right. So if I believe I own the company or the team, my incentive is to extract maximum short-term value. But if I believe I'm a steward, entrusted with these resources for a season, that changes my risk profile completely.
Precisely. The culture of ownership cultivates possession, scarcity, control. It leads to brittle leadership that just collapses under stress. Stewardship, on the other hand, it cultivates responsibility, abundance through wise investment, and sacrificial care. This framework argues that true success, what the source calls purposeful fidelity, is measured by faithful multiplication for the good of others, not just for personal gain. And this builds leadership for endurance and moral clarity, refusing all those common pitfalls of ego-driven, control-heavy management. It's a long-term strategy for survival.
Okay, so moving from that core philosophy to actual practice, the scope of stewardship here is incredibly holistic. It's not just about the finances. The source says we have to steward people, finances, time, culture, and ethics, all of them, as interconnected assets that demand equal care.
That holistic view is essential. It pulls stewardship out of just the accounting department and puts it into the daily rhythm of the organization. So for you, the listener, the framework promises things like greater personal productivity through time mastery, better financial wisdom. But let's focus on that cultural asset for a second. Stewarding culture means actively protecting the organization's values. If you let the culture degrade through, inconsistency or unethical compromises, all your other assets become liabilities.
That makes perfect sense. But if this shift is all about accountability, how do you implement that without it feeling punitive? You need systems that support integrity, not systems that just breed fear or micromanagement.
Well, the book is designed as a blueprint, so it provides some really actionable tools. Accountability is described not as a bureaucratic burden, but as a spiritual discipline that protects integrity and builds trust. The concepts are made real through things like inventories, scorecards, dashboards, and scenario planning. For example, a stewardship inventory might force you to audit not just your revenue, but the health of your team relationships. A relationship score might sit right next to your financial score on a dashboard.
That's intriguing. But where leaders really struggle is navigating that moral ambiguity. Those gray areas where the choice isn't clearly right or wrong, but more like expedient versus wise. That's where this Steward's compass comes in, right?
It's a critical tool, yeah. The Steward's Compass uses 4 questions, inspired by biblical wisdom, to navigate tough ethical decisions. Let's take a concrete scenario. Imagine a project requires you to rush deployment, potentially compromising customer data security, all to hit a critical quarterly earnings deadline.
A very common corporate trade-off. So how does the compass guide that decision?
You apply the 4 tests. The first question is, does this honor God's priorities? Now, in universal ethical terms, this means, does it prioritize justice, mercy, and humility? Cutting corners on security just to enrich shareholders arguably fails that test right there.
Okay. So what's the second question?
Does this protect human dignity? So, are they vulnerable? In this case, the customers whose data is at risk, are they being safeguarded? If the answer is no, the action is immediately flagged as, non-stewardly.
That immediately forces you to consider the external impact, not just the internal profit. What about long-term viability?
That leads to the third question. Is this sustainable? Does it prioritize long-term capacity and trust over some short-term gain? Rushing deployment might get you a short-term win, but if there's a security breach 3 months later, the long-term cost to your reputation is catastrophic. A steward refuses that short-term sugar rush.
And the final question, it seems to put the decision under the ultimate spotlight.
Yes. Would this pass public, communal, and eternal scrutiny? Could you stand before your peers, your customers, or as the book frames it, before God, and give an account for that choice? This institutionalizes ethical reasoning. It makes compromising unacceptable. This raises an important question, though. When the resources we manage are intangible, like influence or attention, which is so relevant in the digital age, how do these values change our metrics?
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the book explicitly applies this ancient philosophy to modern digital leaders, to content creators, to entrepreneurs, it defines 5 distinct domains of digital stewardship.
And these are vital for anyone operating online. Influence, attention, content, community, and capital. For so many, the instinct is to maximize these through extraction, using manipulative techniques to capture user data or attention. The stewardship model says no, these are sacred trusts. They have to be managed responsibly.
Which demands a complete upheaval in how digital success is even measured. The source calls this the missing half of digital success. Let's talk about the hard metrics that have to shift.
The shift is radical. It creates genuine organizational friction. Take influence. We have to replace raw reach, the sheer number of followers, with engaged reach. This means tracking metrics like comments of substance, the return rate of specific groups of users, time on content. It forces the digital leader to refuse those manipulative dark pattern tactics that increase clicks but just completely erode trust.
That's a tough ask, though, especially for a leader whose board or investors are used to seeing those big vanity metrics. My growth might slow down at first.
It might slow extraction, sure, but it accelerates fidelity. When it comes to attention, the shift is from impressions, just showing up on a screen, to tracking average minutes of meaningful interaction. The goal becomes designing fewer, deeper touch points, rather than just constant, shallow, high-frequency posting, reducing noise, increasing signal.
And how does my content strategy change if I'm a steward?
For content, the key metric isn't fleeting virality, it's lifecycle value. You start tracking whether viewers are progressing from being a passive learner to an active practitioner, and maybe eventually to an advocate for your mission. Your content calendars have to be anchored in a mission statement, not just chasing short-term trends. This forces a budget shift. You stop paying agencies focused purely on immediate views and start investing in researchers and educators who deepen the quality.
So quality over speed, how does that translate to community and capital?
Community metrics shift entirely. You move away from just raw member counts and you focus on retention curves and relational depth. The goal is connection, not just gathering a crowd. And finally, with capital, we have to monitor margin and, crucially, multiplier impact.
Explain multiplier impact. What does that look like on a spreadsheet?
It's analyzing how many dollars are redirected to community or mission outcomes for every dollar you earn. For example, if you run a small business, you might track. For every $100 earned, $10 is reinvested in mentoring young leaders. It forces you to view profit not as an end, but as a resource for multiplication. The disruptive conviction here is clear. Success built on extraction is fragile, it's temporary, but success built on stewardship is unshakable because trust becomes the ultimate currency.
It's clear that these new systems, these new metrics, they're not enough without a foundation of character. The source really emphasizes that only integrity, cultivated through specific practices, can sustain this kind of high-impact enterprise long-term. So what are the core formation practices that it suggests for risk management and longevity?
These aren't just optional activities. The book frames them as mandatory risk management practices for the leader's own soul, designed to resist performance idolatry. And they have to be embedded into the organization's life and the leader's own rhythms.
Okay, give us the list.
First, the daily examine. Short, reflective questions at the end of the day. Where did I steward well today? And where did I grasp or try to control what wasn't mine? It's a micro-check on your ego every 24 hours.
That seems like such an essential check. But for a leader who's moving 100 miles an hour, how do you prevent that from just becoming another box-checking exercise?
Well, the key is that it's short, and it's focused on just those two stewardship questions. It's a rapid moral inventory, making sure small compromises don't escalate. The second practice is the weekly Sabbath block, a non-negotiable 24-hour reset. It's designed to resist that frenetic pace of modern productivity. It teaches the leader that their worth is not tied to constant output.
That principle is extremely challenging in today's always-on work culture.
It is. And the source says that if you can't implement the Sabbath block, you're proving that you're an owner obsessed with control, not a steward who trusts the system. Third is peer confession and counsel, having trusted peers who can hold you accountable. It breaks the isolation that so often precedes a leader's failure.
And that fourth practice, the seasonal sabbatical, that's arguably the biggest challenge for any executive. A dedicated 3 to 12-month pause every 5 to 7 years. I mean, that sounds practically impossible.
It is impossible under the traditional ownership model.
Yeah.
But the reason this practice is required isn't just for personal rest. It's focused specifically on mentoring and multiplying leadership. If the organization can't run successfully without you for 3 to 12 months, it means you have failed to steward and multiply the talent around you. The sabbatical is the ultimate test of reproductive leadership. And when these four practices are woven into the structure, the leadership built becomes resilient, reproducible, restorative, and regenerative. You create systems that can outlast you.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, as you look for knowledge that is both clear and actionable? It means shifting your view of leadership from a performance, this relentless need to prove yourself, to a vocation. It becomes a daily practice of tending people, redeeming time, and multiplying resources for purposes that last way beyond your next quarterly report.
And this pathway, it profoundly refines ambition. It anchors your goals in enduring impact, in a lasting legacy, in a calling that builds institutions capable of outlasting a single tenure. It forces a fundamental choice.
A choice between being a consumer of resources or a cultivator.
Exactly. The source quotes Proverbs 21.2. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. Stewardship leaders are those who invest and cultivate for generations, while owners just consume and extract for the immediate moment. The power of this model doesn't lie in clever algorithms or market dominance. It lies in building a deep reserve of trust and integrity, the true wealth that cannot be manufactured or bought. This model creates legacies of wisdom and character, ensuring that your influence continues to grow long after you've stepped away.